Breaking chess news as the world champion Ding Liren is finally back to the chessboard. He is playing a rapid tournament in China against some of the strongest players from his country, and it's a good warming up tournament as he is about to travel to Wijk aan Zee, the Netherlands, to play in the Tata Steel Masters tournament. But first, after a break of almost 9 months, he's finally playing some official rapid game again. He's playing with the white pieces against Bai Jinshi. It's a very strong Chinese grandmaster, 2586 rated. And if you have heard his name not before, make sure to look up on my channel one game played between the two very same players, because it's considered one of Ding Liren's most amazing games he has ever played against this opponent. Now, Ding Liren is playing with the white pieces against Bai Jinshi. It's a knockout tournament, and after drawing the first game, Ding Liren is playing with white. Let's see how this goes. Ding Liren goes for 1 c4, c5, it's the English opening, but very soon, after developing the knights and black strikes in the center with e6 and d5, play is transposing to well-known lines from the Tarrasch opening. So after taking on d5, white places the pawn on d4, and very likely we will get to see a structure where black is going to play with isolated queen's pawn. So far everything is pretty normal. Knight c6, the main move here is bishop g2. Of course, very logical to fianchetto your bishop once you have played the move g3, but Ding Liren plays a very interesting new idea, which has been tested in some top grandmaster games. He played here the move a3. So the idea is probably to take on c5, and after black does recapture, you can quickly follow up with the move b4 to attack the bishop on c5. So here black is going to make a decision with its c-pawn. You can just advance the pawn to c4. Very interesting move, splitting the board in two parts. Was not played. Bai Jinshi goes for the move c takes d4. Now after knight takes d4, the bishop goes to c5, so black is attacking the knight on d4, white goes bishop e3, protecting the knight. But here black has to be careful, because if you're just castle here, then you run into a very simple tactic with knight takes c6, as after recapturing, the bishop on c5 is hanging and white is a piece up. So don't do that. Bishop b6, securing the bishop is now nicely protected by both the pawn and the queen. So this looks normal. Bishop g2 is played, and here you would expect black just to continue developing with a move like castling kingside. I think it's a somewhat more pleasant position for white, but still anything can happen. But instead, Bai Jinshi comes up with a very ambitious move as he goes after the bishop on e3. With the move knight g4, he does put a lot of pressure against the bishop on e3. He's about to ruin white's pawn structure, but it does cost a pawn. It's a pawn sacrifice, as white can now take the pawn on d5. With the knight on f6, that pawn was nicely defended, but here white is a pawn up. Black continues with the plan, knight takes e3. You cannot take back with the knight on e3 because the knight on d4 will be hanging, so you got to take back with the pawn. You're a pawn up, but these pawns are of course not very nice, but at the same time white's knights, they're doing a great job in the center, taking away a lot of squares from the black pieces. Castling kingside played by both players, and here black continues with the move rook e8, putting pressure against the pawn. Even though the pawn is still defended by the knight, it does make sense to place the rook on the half open file, but it also does have some drawbacks, as we will get to see later in the game. Rook c1, white is bringing its rook into the game, bishop d7, and how would you proceed here as white? I think a very logical move would be to move the queen, so that you are about to put pressure on black's position. A move like queen d3 is the move I would play here to consolidate. The queen is well placed in the center, overprotecting the pawn. And one of the ideas is that if black hits the queen, you move the queen again to b3. But now the knight is no longer on c6, putting pressure against the knight on d4. So I think white is in control. He is a pawn up. Even though it's not the nicest pawn in the world, definitely There is some nice play here with fantastic knights, a half open f-file, and so on. But was not played in the game. There followed the move rook to c3. And black had a very interesting possibility here, which he didn't find here. It's a rapid game, short time control. But here black had interesting idea here to take on d4. That improves white's pawn formation, but the idea is very concrete, as the bishop can come to b5 to hit the pawn on e2. I think this could have been, and maybe should have been, played by black. The idea is that now, if you protect the pawn, there is this shot, bishop takes e2, rook takes, queen takes, bishop takes d4 with check. And after the king goes away, you can take on c3. When you do get a position with two minor pieces versus a rook and a pawn, white's maybe a bit better, but very reasonable chances of holding the game here as black. Long variation was all not played in the game. Instead, black went for the move rook c8, bringing the rook into the game, but now the knight goes to b5. These knights are very unpleasant, and we see why the rook is on c3 to keep the pawn on e3 defended. So now knight d6 is a huge threat, hitting both rooks. Black played here the move knight to e5, attacking the knight on b5 with a bishop. And here, again, you would expect the knight coming in to d6. It's still this knight fork, which puts a lot of pressure. After rook takes, pawn takes, you still hit the rook on e8 as well as the pawn on b7. And it looks as if you're winning a pawn. The knight on b7 can never really be trapped because the bishop indirectly defends that square as well. So, missed opportunity. Rook takes c8 was played. You can see Liren is still a bit rusty, of course. Not strange after not playing any serious competitive game in such a long period of time. He takes first on c8, bishop takes, and now the knight goes back to c3. So white is in control, everything is nicely protected. He's still a pawn up, but after knight c4, black is trying to do something back by hitting both the pawns on e3 and b2. Knight takes bishop, queen takes, so there are still threats of regaining the pawn on e3, but the knight comes into d5, attacking the queen, protecting the pawn, but black can take the other pawn. Queen takes b2, but this was all calculated, of course, by both players. The queen goes to a4 with a double attack, hitting the rook and the knight, and also the pawn on a7. It does definitely make sense now just to go back with a knight to d6, so that you do protect the rook on e8. White can take the pawn, but okay, this extra pawn is not really worth that much. Black is relatively active here, can get a bishop out, and I think this should be holdable for black. But instead, they follow the move b5. That's probably even more logical, to protect the knight, take away the threat against the rook, and counter-attacking the queen on a4. But the drawback is seen now. Queen takes a7 with a huge threat of taking the pawn on f7 with checkmate to follow. So bishop e6, protecting the pawn, getting the bishop out. Knight c7, forking the the rook and the bishop. So the rook got to stay on the back rank. If you move the rook to e7, there will follow a back rank mate. So rook goes to f8, knight takes bishop, pawn recaptures. And, well, you can take the rook on f8. But after the exchange of rooks, look at this extra pawn. It's not really worth that much. Black has very good drawing chances here still. Queen e7 is a much more challenging move, played by the world champion, threatening checkmate. So therefore black takes first, rook takes f1, bishop takes f1. Queen e8 is the mating threat. You gotta do something about it. Queen takes a3, offering the exchange of queens. And if you do give a check, the queen is able to interfere on f8. Queen takes pawn with check. King goes to f8, and now it's queen f5 with another check. And after king e7, you may take the pawn on b5, but after queen takes e3, it's black who starts giving checks, and black should definitely save this position despite the minus pawn. Queen g5 is a much more challenging move, giving a check. The king can go to various squares, hard to say which one is the best. Maybe king f7 is the most logical move. King f8 was played in the game. Looks slightly passive, but the queen now keeps the pawn on e3 defended and enables the white king to come into the game. You're going here, so that's a good idea. And well, the pawn cannot easily be advanced. If you do that, then it's queen f4 check, and you're going to pick up the knight. So don't do that. Queen e7 is played. Now if you do exchange queens, black is in good shape. The b pawn is difficult to stop. So white wants to keep queens on the board. Queen f4 check, but there is queen f6. Now the queen is pinned. Bishop g2. Very important that you're not going to take yourself on f6. You want black to take on f4. If that happens, then you improve your pawn structure. Now it's a 4 versus 2 on the king side, and the bishop can easily come back into defense, stopping the b pawn. So white is technically winning in that case. So black is not going to cooperate, is not going to take the queen on f4. Maybe just move the king away to the center. Makes a lot of sense, but instead they follow the move b4. So you want to push your pawn, but the bishop comes to d5 to attack the knight. Knight goes to b6, bishop to b3. Bishop is blocking the pawn, but at the same time, it's also shining through black's position. At some point, there may be some counter-attacking ideas against the black king. King to e7 played, and now white moves the king away from the f-file. So king is safe, queen c3, attacking the bishop, but now bishop goes to g8. This is the strength of the bishop in a lot of endgames, or in general when the position is open or plays just on both sides of the board. The bishop can easily switch from one side to another, having multiple tasks here. That's good for the bishop. Pawn goes to h6, pawn is saved, but queen e4 check. King d6, queen e6 check. Now bishop and queen are working together. King goes to c5. The passed pawn is stopped. Black can never push the pawn to b3. It's time to mobilize our own pawn. e4 is played, and it's a difficult position, but black is still fighting. Queen f6. Black wants to get rid of the queen, but white keeps the queen on the board with queen e8, keeping the bishop defended. And okay, black is also having a difficult time here, and you may just move the queen away, looking for counterplay against the pawn on e2. And there's apparently not a good way to put the black king under pressure. Instead, black became very ambitious now by moving the king to d4, looking at ideas maybe to play king e3 and then queen f2. The queen comes in. Maybe black is trying to play for mate, but the problem is there's queen b5, and you're attacking the pawn on b4, and also the king is quite vulnerable. Also the knight needs to keep protection from the queen. So queen d6 is played, but now white is taking over with the move e5, seizing the initiative, attacking the queen. You cannot take the pawn because you just capture the knight on b6 with check, and that's winning for white. Therefore the queen got to move, but it's no longer able to keep both the knight and queen and pawn defended. Because for instance, if you do play here the move queen to c5, everything is still defended. It runs into the move e3, and the king can no longer keep the queen defended because the bishop covers these two squares. If you do take on e3, queen takes c5, white is winning. So instead, queen c7 is played, but now it's queen takes b4 with check. And even now, black cannot take the pawn on e5 because of the beautiful mating pattern with the queen and bishop covering both diagonals. Checkmate in the middle of the board. Therefore the king went to e3, but now the pawn goes even further. White is about just to push the pawn to e7 and e8. Knight c8 is the most stubborn defense, but white is technically winning here anyway. Look what happened. Knight d5 instead, also covering the e7 square and attacking the queen. But now it's queen b3 with check. It's a double attack. The king has to go back. Well, you may even consider actually to interfere with the knight on c3 because the queen protects the knight. But here again, another deflection motive. You play the move e7 and you're about to queen, and the queen is overloaded, cannot take on e7 because then the knight will just be captured. Therefore, king d4 was played, and now the final touch of the game. The world champion is still capable of finding some very simple tactics, but that's a very nice and good feeling for him to be able to play the following deflection sacrifice. With the move queen takes d5, you're eliminating the knight. If you do take back, which was played in the game, there is the move e7. With a discovered check, the pawn will be promoted next. So if you move the king, it's e8 queen. And therefore, after the move e7, Bai Jinshi resigned. It's the first victory in 9 months for the world champion. That's a nice warming up. He is moving on to the semi-finals of this rapid event in China, in which he is going to play against Wang Hao, another very strong top Chinese player who also played in the candidates before. So that's going to be a very interesting clash. Definitely we are going to have a look at it and on this channel. So make sure to subscribe and come back to see more exciting games in the following days. See you soon. Bye bye.